In this video, I'm going to be doing an example of solving quadratic equations by using the quadratic formula. So when would you want to use this strategy? Now, anytime you see a quadratic equation, a lot of you might think to factor, but you might have to use the quadratic formula if you get stuck. Let me show you what I mean. If you go ahead and started to try factoring, maybe using the box method, then your squared term x squared would go in the first box. Your constant, negative 8, would go in the last box, and your negative 4x would go over here off to the side. Now I'm looking for a factor pair, two numbers that when I multiply them, I'm going to get negative 8, and the sum of those two numbers will give me negative 4. So let's list out some factor pairs. I could do negative 1 times 8, negative 2 times 4, positive 1 times negative 8, or positive 2 times negative 4. Okay, let's see if we can find any of these that would give us a sum of negative 4. Negative 1 plus 8 would be positive 7. Negative 2 plus 4 would be positive 2. 1 plus negative 8 would be negative 7. 2 plus negative 4 would be negative 2. So none of these factor pairs are going to give us negative 4. So we kind of run into an issue factoring. So one option that you could use if this happens is something that we call the quadratic formula. Some of you might have been taught a song to remember the formula. Some of you might just have it memorized. But all you need to know for the formula is the values of a, b, and c, and then we plug them into this formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So if I want to use that for this quadratic equation right here, all I need to do first is identify my a, b, and c. And remember, this comes from the form ax squared plus bx plus c, which would mean that my a, since there's not a coefficient in front of x squared, would be 1. My b would be a negative 4. And my c would be a negative 8. So these are the values that I'm going to be plugging in to the quadratic equation. Let's go ahead and do that. X equals negative b, so negative 4 plus or minus the square root of negative 4 squared, because b squared, minus 4 times a is 1 times c is negative 8, all over 2 times a is 1. Alright, then all we need to do is simplify as much as possible if we're doing this by hand without a calculator. So we would end up with x equals negative 4 is positive 4 plus or minus the square root. Negative 4 squared is 16. Negative 4 times 1 times negative 8 is a plus 32. All over 2 times 1 is 2. Let's keep going. If I add 16 and 32 together, x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 48 all over 2. And then we can just simplify that square root. So if I think about a factor pair for 48 that has a perfect square, I could do 16 times 3, so x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 16 times 3 divided by 2, and now I can take the square root of that 16, so x equals 4 plus or minus the square, or it's 4 square root of 3 all over 2. Alright, last step. Since both of these terms up here in the numerator are divisible by 2, I can divide both of them by 2 to get rid of that denominator. So I have x equals 2, 4 divided by 2 is 2, plus or minus 4 divided by 2 is 2, square root of 3. Now if you're doing this by hand, then you can go ahead and stop here because you're as simplified as possible. If this is on a calculator section, and you wanted to save some time from the beginning, you could have just plugged this in to your calculator from the get-go. So let's take a look. If I had negative 4, and you don't have to just do it as two separate ones, so let's do plus 4 first, plus the square root of negative 4 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 8, all of that divided by 2 times 1. Let's take a look. X equals 5.464. Okay, so that's one of our solutions. Let's try this again. I'm just going to copy this over, but I'm going to change it to a minus the square root so we can get our second solution. Negative 4 minus the square root. And we have x equals negative 1.464. So here are our two solutions in decimal form, and we can check just for fun that these are equivalent. Let's check really quickly. 2 plus 2 square root of 3, that gives us the 5.464, nice. And 2 minus 2 square root of 3 gives us the negative 1.464. So these are the same solutions, just one of them is in decimal form, and one of them, if you don't have a calculator, is just simplifying as much as possible. So that's an example of solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula.